Hello, this is the developer commentary for my latest project, Jetpack Fox, which was started on July 7th of 2024. If you would like extended developer notes, that is in the backdrop of the Scratch project itself, where you can find the date I made a certain asset and how long it took to make those assets. Additionally, you can find screenshots in the back here, where I detail when I finished certain obstacles and how they looked at the time of doing them. As an indie developer, I've always found it important to have a clear sense of vision when making a video game. The reason a clear sense of vision is important is because that allows the video game project to focus on certain aspects while not working on other aspects. So for example, this project is a platformer that is stylized in the same manner that Getting Over with Bennett Foddy was stylized. That game was made in 2017 by, Bennett Foddy, where the project incentivizes deliberate jumping and an unforgiving open world with very tough level design. And in the same way, this project is designed similarly. In this project, I have three main mechanics. First, I can jump 3 times, and whenever I hit the ground, those 3 jumps recover. I can turn, and I can collide with objects around me. It's a very hard control scheme, but what I can do is, if I deliberately aim my jumps, I can get past any obstacle that is presented to me in the game. But I have to be very deliberate about this. So for example, if I go over to this dead tree, I cannot get past it unless I time my jumps properly and if I am aiming in the correct way. This gets a little bit more difficult when I present more difficult jumps, like this cliff here. So I need to do 2 up jumps and 1 right jump. But also, as you can see, this is a very narrow ledge, and if I go too hard, then I'll fall all the way back down to the bottom of the game. And this is the main gameplay loop. I need to get past these obstacles in the most precise manner possible and the most fast manner possible. Because of this focus on mainly level design, I need to design around a character that can jump 3 times and in any direction at any given time. So I need to make very difficult obstacles that test the player's strengths and weaknesses, and I need to make sure that they're not too hard or the player might quit before the game is over, and that wouldn't be any fun. I also made a point to make sure that the level design does not have any extra mechanics. I only want the player to master the movements of the Jetpack Fox. So for example, I wouldn't add another jump pad, or I wouldn't add another collision type, or I wouldn't add slippery ice, because that would not follow this gameplay vision. Because this is such a unique moveset, that means that I can predict that the player probably will not be very good at the game at the beginning. And the reason I can predict this is because most modern platformers only have 3 main controls, going left, right, and jumping up and down, whereas in this game, you cannot move left or right unless you jump, and you have to jump in order to progress through the game. With this in mind, I need to show the player how to play the game, basically. And I'm not going to directly teach them by using text boxes because, to be frank with you, that would be very boring, and I would probably lose my players' engagement over a very small amount of time. So therefore, I've designed these first few obstacles to give a small understanding of how the basic mechanics of the game work. So to bridge this gap, I make it abundantly clear at the first obstacle what this game is about. This game is about jumping, and you have to jump in order to make it past the first obstacle. While it is a very easy obstacle, it will present at least some difficulty to the player, where they have to realize, oh, I need to make a deliberate jump in order to make it past this obstacle. And then the next obstacles elaborate on that. The second obstacle and the first biggest obstacle of the game is the cliffside. The cliffside incentivizes the player to learn more about the vertical movement of the Jetpack Fox. If the player goes too far right, they'll simply bounce off the cliffside and fall all the way back down. If they go too high up, they might also bounce back to the bottom, but they will progress. And once they have gotten to the top of the cliff, they have almost mastered vertical movement, but not quite. That is for a later section of the game. All of the obstacles in Jetpack Fox have a similar design mindset. Each one must teach the player something new about the mechanics of the game, or make it so that they master the mechanics of the game. Running through all of the obstacles, the player learns something new. With the rocks, they learn how to control their horizontal movement. With the giant tree, they learn something about vertical movement. With the cave obstacles, they learn more about horizontal movement and what that looks like in a confined space. They also learn more about how to use collisions and how the collisions can either benefit or draw back from their movement. And once they have gotten to the top of the mountain, they have truly mastered the mechanics of the game and can move fairly freely throughout the game without much hiccup, and that is where speedrunning comes in. As of now, I don't have many speedrunning mechanics, but it is planned in the future to add a clock to this game because every time I beta test this game, someone says that this would be a fantastic game to speedrun, and games with very hard mechanics lend themselves well to this top tier play, especially a game about speed and that incentivizes inertia like Jetpack Fox does. Designing a game around speed presents a few unique challenges. For example, I need to show the player that they are going fast without them being so fast that they are out of control or they go outside the camera limits of Scratch. The Parallax background shows the player where they are in space even when they are off the ground. The visuals of the level show where they are in space additionally, and the wind particles show you how fast you are going and in what direction. Continually, the ears of the character shows you how fast you are going and in what direction you are going. The tail drags behind slightly to show which direction you are also going, and the face is facing what direction that the player is going in order to communicate that even more. If I remove those elements, it would still be obvious where the player is going, but it wouldn't be so clear when you're going at breakneck speeds. With those core principles in mind, I have been designing Jetpack Fox to be a game about speed, unforgiving open world level design, inertia, and a sense of persistence and accomplishment. However, if you want to know the specifics of how I made these mechanics, that's where the programming comes in, and that's what I'll be explaining now. So here we are in the Scratch editor. You can see that I have a drawing board, a player sprite, a collision sprite, a visual sprite, a background sprite, a parallax sprite, particle sprite, a penguino sprite, a personal favorite of mine, the sound sprite, an overlay sprite, a pause menu, and a mobile controls sprite, as well as the backdrop sprite that comes default with every Scratch project. To further elaborate on these sprites, the drawing board sprite was where I had all of my ideas stocked. For example, I wanted to make all of these obstacles in the game, and some didn't make it, but ideas of these obstacles still made it into the final product. This obstacle can be seen in the cave, this obstacle is the tree obstacle, this obstacle is the cliffside, this obstacle is also in the cave, this obstacle is the rocks obstacle, this obstacle isn't quite in the game, but I made something similar towards the end of the mountain, but this still served as a good base. And this one is one that also did not make it in the game in any semblance. It felt like this one was too difficult, so I did not end up making it in the final product. This is the player sprite. The player sprite is one of the most complicated sprites in the game, but it is the main sprite in the game, and it necessitates a lot of care from me as the developer. This sprite's animations are separated into separate costumes, and I've displayed a similar workflow in my sine wave project explaining how to make procedural animation using sine waves. As you can see, the face, the tail, the ears, and the jetpack are all separated into their own sprites and then are layered on top of each other when they're animated in-game. This allows it so that the game can animate it for me and I do not need to make separate costumes for each and every animation type that could happen in the game. If we go over to the code section of the player sprite, we can see that this is a very heavily modified platformer script from the popular scratcher Griffpatch. But when I say very heavily modified, I mean that 80% of this sprite is my work. I've only used the workflow of Griffpatch's platformer, but if you would like to know how to make a platformer like he does, he has a YouTube channel, and I will link the video in the description. If we move further into the player sprite, we can see that all of these clones correspond to the different costumes that I showed earlier in the costume section of the sprite. This allows me to layer all of these sprites on top of each other onto the Scratch editor in order to make the procedural animation. All of these clones have their own separate code within this player sprite in order to condense this project into not so many sprites. This is a workflow that I enjoy in most of my games, and you'll see in most of my other games that I use some kind of clone separation code in order to make a project work. This feels more consistent and more reliable for me, but it can be very confusing to new scratchers. However, if we go back to this main block of code, we can see that all of the clones are controlled by clone 0. Clone 0 is the platformer in this instance, so the clone 0 will control all of the collisions that we face, all of the calculations that we face, and all of the inputs while the player is playing the game, and the clones will simply layer on top of it in order to make the animations. While the specifics of this sprite and how the inner workings of it work is far too complicated for me to explain in one video, I will say that a lot of this sprite has a lot of switches and a lot of clone separation scripts. So for example, down here I've separated all of the clones further into their own separate animation types. and all of this math here is used in order to calculate the direction of where the sprite should be directed towards while they're animating themselves. Additionally, the gates come in here, so for example, this is the animations for the face costumes. It is just a ton of if-then statements, and it isn't ultimately that complicated, but the way they're nested is very complicated, and which is why I say the specifics are far too much for me to explain here. So I will be moving on to the collision sprite. Moving on to the collision sprite, the visual sprite, and the background sprite. I'm putting these together because all three of these work exactly the same, but are just simply have different functions. The collision sprite states where the colliders are in the game, so all of these black boxes indicate where I collide on the screen. So for example, if I jump into this tree, this black box is what I just collided with, and as I'm hitting the ground, this black box is what I'm colliding with. I've separated the collision from the visual, and furthermore from the background, and I layer them on top of each other so that I have an extra sense of control while I'm making my project. So for example, if I jump up here, you can see that the player sprite is behind the visual sprite and is colliding with the collision sprite, but the background sprite is in the back behind all of that. This gives the impression that I have a lot of depth in this game, and it allows me to control exactly how I want the player to perceive the world. However, there's a technology that comes with this that I haven't seen used in other projects, so I'll be explaining it simply here. The visual, the collision, and the background sprite all use this same idea, where if the Jetpack Fox is in the top right of this quadrant, then the top right, and the right quadrants will be rendered in at the same time, because if I go into my developer tools, if I go over here, this is the corner of the quadrant, there's a small seam right there that we can kind of see it, but pretend that this is a quadrant. If I'm at the right side of this quadrant, then this box will render in like here. And if I'm at the top of this quadrant, the top left and the top right quadrants will also render in. This makes it very seamless to the human eye because I've made sure to make these seams as imperceptible as possible, but you can still see them if you have a very close eye. And if you go to the left of the quadrant, then these will shift over and will now render in the top left, the top, and the bottom. And if the player is in the bottom of the quadrant, then it will render like so. The center, the left, the bottom left, and the bottom one. This applies to the collision sprite, the visual sprite, and the background sprite, and that is why in the code that they have only 4 sprites available to them. They simply just keep on shifting around to give the impression that you are in a scrolling world. The reason for this very complicated way of rendering the world is because this fairly optimizes how fast the game can run and makes it so that I do not have as many clones as possible. As you can see, there are 48 clones, but as you can see in the costumes section of this, there are far more than 48 costumes in here. I would have to render in 65 times 3 clones, and that is above the clone limit of Scratch, or would eventually get there. In order for me to make as much level as I possibly want, I've put in the system so that I do not render as many clones, and the processors do not have to render as much or what is off the screen of the game. However, moving on from the collision, the visual, and the background sprites, the Parallax sprites do not do the same thing. I've simply made it so that all of the clones are rendered in at the same time, and while this isn't very effective, it was the best way that I could put it in a safe amount of time. I didn't know how to do the same thing on the Parallax sprite that I did with the collision, the visual, and the background sprites. And ultimately this is fine because I only have 15 clones rendered in as of now, and I'm almost completed the game. I don't think I will need that many Parallax sprites, so it's fine to render in 15 more sprites on top of the collision, visual, and background sprites. Admittedly, this is a little bit lazy, but wherever I could cut corners in this project, I did cut corners in this project, and you'll see that more in the future. For those of you wondering what a parallax effect is an effect that is used to give the illusion of depth without actually giving depth to the game. This is especially useful in 2D engines, and there are many videos on YouTube covering such an effect. But explained simply here, the foreground moves very fast as I move left and right. However, this background sprite moves slower, and that implies that there is distance between me, the foreground, and the background that's even back there. I would like to iterate that this effect is extremely important for Jetpack Fox. Right now, I have disabled the parallax effect, and I have no idea where I am right now in the world. The background is there, and the Jetpack Fox is there, but if I move left and right, I have no idea where I'm going to land until I actually hit there. And this is called a blind jump in most platformers. And this is something that designers have had to design around for a while now. using various methods, but in this game, I'm using the Parallax method in order to design around it. If I make a jump over here, I have no idea where I'm going to land until I actually hit a tree or something like that, because now I can actually see the ground around me, and I have a nice sense where everything is. To make this even more apparent why this effect is so important, I've re-enabled the effect to show you that as I'm gliding around, I can see that there is a landmass to the right of me, there is the ground below me, and the sky indicates where I am in space. So I can see that I'm probably towards the left and I'm near-ish the tree that was to the left. While this is a very subconscious effect, it is a very important effect to have in order to know where you are in space. The next sprite I'll be showcasing is the particles sprite. And while this is very hard to see, it is very noticeable if the sprite is not here. So, for example, I'm going to jump and I'm going to pause. Down here are the particle sprites that I just jumped from, and this wind sprite is also within that sprite. What these sprites showcase is where you were and where you are going. So, for example, if I jump and then jump twice, I know that I blasted upwards from these particles, and that this wind indicator shows how fast I'm going in that direction. So if I'm going lightning fast, it will be even more apparent to me where I'm going. But if I'm going slow, you can barely even see it. The way that this sprite works is by cloning itself over and over again whenever I make a jump. Whenever I make a jump, I clone 4 more clones in order to stay as this sprite, this sprite, this sprite, and this sprite. And then there will always be one continuous sprite, i.e. this speed sprite, that will stay onto the Jetpack Fox and only appear when I'm moving fast. Then using trigonometry, I point them in the same direction that they're supposed to go, and I give them a set speed that then decays and then they fade out and then get reused in the next jump. I would like to note that all of the particles used are not cloned again every single time I make a jump. I simply reuse the previous 4 clones that are already in existence to make the particles of the jump. The reason this is because I need a very strict clone cap in order to layer the sprites properly, and while this was a very difficult compromise to make, it was one that was ultimately necessary because layering sprites on the Z-axis in Sprite is very difficult, and I spent a few days trying to figure that problem out, and this is the best solution that I could come to. For our next sprite, we will be going over the Penguino sprite, and the Penguino sprite is very simple, as the main function of the sprite is to simply do the Penguino by using a sine function as the animation. While yes, this is a very silly character to have in my game, into every single one of my Scratch projects, and for those fans of mine that look hard enough, they will be able to find every single one, and a Vincrafts game would just not be a Vincrafts game without this character. Now moving on to one of the strangest sprites in my game is the sound sprite. The sound sprite is here because you cannot play multiple sounds from one sprite in a given Scratch game. If I want to play the sound of the fox hitting the ground and the jumping sound at the same time, that will not be allowed by Scratch. So I've made this one sprite that has a whole host of other sprites underneath its reign to play the sounds like separate channels in a music program. The way I do this is by cloning the sprite multiple times so that clone 4, clone 3, clone 2, and clone 1, as well as the initial sprite, all play their own separate sounds at once. For those of you audio engineers, you may be wondering how I made the sounds present in Jetpack Fox. What I did for this game was a very unique process that I haven't done in any other game, and that is the process of Foley. You can look up Foley on YouTube, and I'll link some videos in the description for how this practice is generally used. But what I did, essentially, is make a ton of sounds in my house that sounds kind of like the sound that I want, but not exactly, and then layer it on top of each other and edit it slightly in order to make the exact sounds that I'm looking for. You may be wondering how I made the jet depleted sound and the jet full sound, as these are very mechanical sounds and I would not have been able to recreate them in the physical space. In order to make these sounds, I have used a tool called Beepbox, developed by John Netsky at ShackTool on Twitter, as it is a very powerful free and open source software that allows you to make chiptune music with a desktop browser. The reason I use Beepbox and not something more popular like BFXR.net, which was recently discontinued by Flash Player, is, well, I'm very familiar with the tools of Beepbox, and I have used Beepbox to compose songs in previous projects, and I've gotten such a good handle on it that I feel like using anything else wouldn't make a lot of sense to me, so I simply use Beepbox. I will link beepbox.co and bfxr.net down in the description. These are both extremely powerful tools, and I do highly suggest using them if you are looking for a chiptune aesthetic for your game. If you are not, then I do not recommend these tools. Going to the next sprite, overlays. This sprite simply overlays on top of all of the previous sprites in order to give certain screen effects. So for example, as you enter the cave, you may notice that the screen gets darker with a dark vignette around the sides. That is what this sprite is doing. Additionally, when you press the pause screen, this overlay in the back is also attributed to this sprite. This sprite will have the sliders and the icons that are present on the background here. For those of you who have used the graphics editor of Scratch extensively, you may notice that this back sprite has an opacity. The way that this is possible is by using the Scratch Add-ons extension that was made by Griffpatch and various other creators in the Scratch community. Without this would be a very difficult effect to achieve, and I would probably have to use another sprite with a ghost effect in order to achieve this. While on the subject of Scratch Add-ons extension, the Scratch Add-on extension has been very integral to the development process of Jetpack Fox. Without this tool, I would not be able to make this project as elegantly as I have here. While there are too many features to go over for the Scratch Add-ons extension, I would like to thank a lot of features here. For example, I would like to thank the Dark Mode extension, the Code Cloning and Shortcuts extension, as well as the Snapping to Grid extension. I cannot state enough how much this add-on has streamlined the process of this project. Without it, I think I would still be working on the forest to this day. If you have used Scratch extensively, I highly recommend this add-on, as it will greatly improve your workflow and keep you from a lot of headaches that Scratch may have. Continuing on our sprite journey, the pause menu sprite houses all of the sprites that are associated with the pause menu. So for example, this slider, these buttons, and this play button are all housed within this pause menu sprite. And the reason that I have done this is by, again, using the clone ID methodology that I mentioned earlier in the video. While the pause menu is not complete right now, I would like to add a timer functionality so that speedrunners can see how much time they've taken in order to beat the game, as well as a leaderboard to show who is the fastest player of Jetpack Fox. Additionally, I would like to have a level select feature on the pause menu, so that if a player gets stuck on an obstacle, they are able to skip it. However, this level select feature will not extend into the mountain section, as the mountain section is supposed to be a very hard section. And finally, the last sprite of the game is the mobile controls sprite. This only shows up if you enable mobile controls, and it will completely disable your keyboard. I have not fully figured out how to make mobile controls in Scratch, as Scratch does not allow for multiple button presses at the same time on one screen. And while this is a very difficult issue to solve, I've been looking into a lot of tutorials in order to figure out this issue, and hopefully by the time this game comes out, this is an issue that is solved. The reason I'm adding this to this particular game is because on my last platformer game, Purple Ninja, that was very popular, a lot of people expressed the interest of having mobile controls, even though I did not think that mobile controls fit into the design of the game. As Purple Ninja is a very tight platformer, and I don't think mobile controls lend very well to Purple Ninja. However, because people wanted it so much, I think that I should add it to this game, as well as the fact that the mobile control scheme could fit very well into this game, even though this game it could also be considered a tight platformer. While not technically a sprite in Scratch terms, the backdrop section is used for all of the global controls and the camera controls of the game, as well as initializing certain lists that need to be present in order for layering to work. This next functionality, the layering functionality, took me a very long time to develop correctly, and while I still am not fully satisfied with the solution that I came up with, it is the only solution that I could come up with in a reasonable amount of time, and I was so frustrated with this particular functionality that I spent so long on it, and once I had any solution, I was fine with being content with it. But basically, the solution that I came up with finally was using this list of all of the sprites' clones number being listed. So, for example, the drawing board has 0 clones, the player has 7 clones, the collision has 4 clones, the visual has 4 clones, the background has 4 clones, etc, etc. And then organizing them in a list in order to know exactly where they are supposed to be on the Z position, and then layering them accordingly. I don't want to get to the details of this because I do not like this system, but it's the only system that worked. But basically, how the layering system works is that the broadcast is broadcasted to one clone out of every single clone in the project, and then layers that one precisely, and then moves on to the next clone in the next order, and then moves it to the back, and then layers it precisely, and then repeats throughout the whole project. This isn't a very fast workflow, but again, I was taking what I could get. Finally, I would like to go over how I made the world of Jetpack Fox, as this aspect of the project alone has been easily the most time-consuming aspect of this project. I start with the collision, as the collision is very easy to draw and it's very easy to iterate on. I will test around to see if the collision feels right and if the obstacle is to my liking, or maybe it's too difficult, or maybe the distance isn't right. I'll keep on iterating on the collision before I go into the visuals. The reason for this is because I don't want to make a ton of visuals and then have to go back and change them later down the line, because that would take a lot of time and I do not want to waste that much time, especially when I'm an indie developer and I've already spent 52 hours on this project. So once the collision is done, then I move on to the visuals, and this is the time where the collision is kind of locked in. Sometimes I will make a tweak here and there for the collision, but it's not going to be a big sweeping change, as that would mean that I would have to change the visuals and the background, and maybe even the parallax as well. Then I'll move on to the background, and then if necessary, I'll move on to the parallax and the background, and that is in essence how the world is made in Jetpack Fox. And now I'd like to give you a quick demo of how I make the world in specifics. The reason for making this commentary so early and not when the game is finished is so that I can show you a little bit of this process. So right here, I've created this cave shaft, and if I keep on moving over, there is no details here. I've not completely finished this area, but this is the bare bones of what an area would look like. You can see that the visual only has the outline and it has the fills for each and every area, but it's not completely rendered. Having this base ensures that I do not have to make any extra graphics that I do not need to. For example, I would not make anything rendered down here because the camera can never go past that point. But going more into the nitty-gritty, what I'll basically do is these outlines, I need to make them jagged, so I'll go in, I'll change a few of the nodes here, and I'll tastefully make it so that they're kind of jagged, but not like too jagged. But also, I'll do this fast, and then at the end, I'll make them all pointed because the cave has a very pointy style, and I want to make this as fast as possible. And I'll do the same over here to this outline, and make it pointed, and then repeat. And then because there's some colors that aren't being fully rendered, I'll go in here and then like change this up, move this over here, move that over there, and now that gray spot is completely behind it. And down here and over here it looks like we're fine, so I might go in later and change that, but for now we're fine. And because I've already made so many assets for this game, no one's going to notice if I go down here into this area and take some of these spikes, or stalactites I should say, and stalagmites, and then bring them up here, copy and paste, and then lay them on top of here again. And because I am directly copy and pasting, I don't want to make it too noticeable, so maybe I'll flip these, maybe I'll take this one and put it on the ceiling instead, maybe I'll take this one, put this on the ground, and maybe I'll bend it a little bit in order to give it a little bit more differentiation, because I don't want it to be so similar that a player recognizes, but I also don't want it to be so dissimilar that I'm putting such a big workload on myself, as I am only one developer and I need to take every shortcut that I can possibly take. Additionally, I need some rocks up below this, so I'm going to take this rock, Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, place it down there. I've also made a point to make it so that all of the graphics in this game are very minimalistic. I do not want to spend a ton of time making these levels, as making even one of these tiles takes about an hour, and throughout this whole process, I've made over 600 tiles, or no. I've had to have made over 100 tiles in the clones, background, and collision tiles, and it's getting a little bit exhausting, but because I love this project so much, I think I can continue for a few more. And again, I'm taking the same process of copy and pasting and then changing it up a little bit, and then Sometimes, every so often, I'll keep a unique aspect throughout every single area of the game. So, for example, if I go back down here, you can see that there's a shell down here, and there's also like this seaweed looking thing. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's a plant and it differentiates it from the other parts of the map. And for example, I'll have this tree here. This tree does not show up anywhere else, and I will not copy and paste that aspect because it is unique to here. This tree will never show up in any other aspect. This cliffside will never show up in any other part of the game. And as well as this fossil here will never show up in any other part of the game. The reason that I've put this in here is to make it so that each level feels distinct, and it takes attention away from all of the repeating aspects of the game, because if I only copy and pasted all of the assets that I had previously, it would look very samey very fast, and I do not want to make the player feel like they are not progressing, which is why I've also had these different areas throughout the game. Additionally, another very important aspect of the game is the camera. As you can see, there is no camera action that is enforced right now. Simply, I made limits so that the camera cannot go past this tree and not go below this ground, as well as when I go up here, it does not shift from that left side. I've made specific camera controls so that whenever you encounter an obstacle, the camera will shift to point towards that obstacle. This makes it so that you are not blindly jumping into the void in order to find where you have to go. You clearly see where you're starting and where you're ending, and that is extremely important, especially for a platformer like this, in order to not make blind jumps, as blind jumps are not very good game design. But ultimately, I hope this video allows you to understand all the intricacies of game design and all of the decisions that go behind making some of your favorite games, or even inspires you to make a game of your own. I do truly believe that video games are one of the highest forms of art, as it has a unique capacity to combine so many different mediums into one single thing. It combines drawing, programming, an understanding of how humans operate and how they learn, animation, sounds, and writing in order to make one coherent experience. Thank you for watching. Hello again. So this is back on September 30th of 2024, back on Jetpack Fox project, and I initially did not think that I would have to make this video, but as I was beta testing, I was looking around the cave, and one of the beta testers had confirmed one of the suspicions that I had about the cave, and that it was too dull. As compared to the rest of the world in Jetpack Fox, the world is very colorful and vibrant, and then it went into this very dingy cave, which didn't have a lot of color, and I really tried to make it look interesting using shapes, but ultimately it did not work. And I wanted to put this in because this is arguably one of the most important processes of, well, making a game, is iteration. You will make a mistake when you're designing a game, and you need to, like, go back on ideas that you thought were good at first. When you beta test, some things don't work, like, one of the things that has been very frustrating for me as, well, the developer, is this pause menu. This pause menu has given me a lot of headaches because I can't figure out how to accurately depict the ideas that I'm trying to sell to the player. So, for example, this music bar is confusing, this sound bar is less confusing, but people generally get this. But this mobile control button has been very confusing. People have not understood that when this is off, it is off, when it's on. So I've kind of given in and just put text on it, which is arguably a very dull solution, but it's the only one that I think will work, and if this one doesn't work, then I need to figure out another solution. Another thing that came up was the level layout was a bit confusing. One of the beta testers suggested that I put it down horizontally, and I kind of, well, facepalmed on that one because, well, it's very obvious to put it in this left to right thing, but I just oversaw it and I just didn't do it. So another issue I found is that most players, when beta testing, did not notice the pause menu at all. So in an instance where they are, say, frustrated at an obstacle, I've made this frustration variable that increases every time you fall. And if you fall down 5 times, this exclamation mark will pop up, and it will lead you to the pause menu. And the pause menu will then ask if you would like to skip this particular obstacle. The reason I added this was solely because of beta testing. I did not think that this feature was going to be a feature at the beginning, and, well, it is proven to be very good. as most players that have played this game have gotten so frustrated that they've wanted to skip an obstacle, and this system allows them to do so. Additionally, some players do not like the frustration that I'm providing in this game, and this is intentional, that the game is frustrating. However, allowing the player to have this choice allows for a better experience. So, for example, if they just want to see the levels and all of the designs like one of my beta testers had, this is there for that particular player if they want to, but not if they have to. As of recording this on August 17th, I am working on the final obstacles of the cave section. Initially, I wanted this game to be broken down into 3 main sections: the forest section, the cave section, and the mountain section. But as of now, I've divided it into 2 sections. The forest and the cave is where easygoing players can complete the game and feel a sense of accomplishment, whereas the hardcore players who want to test their skills even more can go into the mountains and fully embrace the getting over it style of game. So this is me developing in post, and I never added that getting over it section that I wanted to do. Right now, the mountain is just the finishing flag, and that is all, which is unfortunate, but I think it was a necessary sacrifice. I made sure that in the forest section and the cave section, that if you lose progress, you haven't lost all of your progress. You can simply return back to the starting point using clever design tricks and ledges in order to get back to the start of the obstacle. Whereas in the mountain section, if you fall down, you lose all of your progress. And if you don't lose all your progress, it was a very tight save that could save your progress. This would be so frustrating to easygoing players that I decided to leave it for the hardcore players who really want to test their skill, because they're more willing to lose that kind of progress, and by extension, learn more from their errors. Again, so this is me completely done literally everything that this project has demanded of me, and it has been a very, very long journey getting here. I'm playing Jetpack Fox as I say this, by the way, but I don't know, man. Spending 5 months on this ginormous project has made me realize a lot of things, and it's helped me work through a lot of things in my life that's like happening right now, and just like, I don't know, like, this probably is one of my biggest projects. No, it is my biggest project, actually. I know that for a fact. And like, it's funny to think about, because I know that people are going to say, like, oh, continue Purple Ninja, because I don't think I'll ever get away from that one, because that was just, like, such a massive project, and people really wanted to see that finished. And back on that project, I said that I wanted to limit the scope of, like, my projects more, because, you know, I'm not going to release anything if I keep on increasing the scope. And this is, like, max capacity. Like, I barely finished this project. I don't think if I made this project any bigger, I would have been able to finish it. So, like, I'm yet again saying that I need to decrease the scope of this project, and, like, oh man, projects to come have to be smaller, because, like, I cannot keep up with this, like, scope increase that I've been doing. And, like, I don't know, it's a fantastic feeling to, like, be releasing stuff again, and that's, like, kind of something I've been realizing, like, I need to keep on, like, releasing projects, or, like, I can't be such a perfectionist on so many of my projects, is what I meant to say. Like, I don't know, I have a lot of really decent projects that I really want to release to the public, because they are genuinely good, but they're unfinished in my eyes, so I need to, like, just release them at some point, because no project is going to be perfect, and, well, this project does have a lot of flaws, but it's, like, it's good enough, and it's still, like, a fantastic project in my eyes. Oh, I should probably show you guys where all the pinguinos are. Also, this dedication down here, I do genuinely mean it. Like, this took so long to make, and I love this project, like, to death, and I think it's probably my masterpiece that's gonna be on Scratch, because I want to lower the, like, scope of my new project, so. But yeah, without being, like, too drony, like, I want to branch out first off, and I also want to make it so, like, I can release stuff that's, like, also not on Scratch, even though I do love Scratch. I want to go on to, like, other game engines, and I've said that before, and I just had to keep on saying that, like, kind of like my Purple Ninja project. Like, I need to lower the scope yet again, and I'm saying that again, like, years later, so. And I mean, yeah, that's I think it for Jetpack Fox. I'm gonna be releasing like a few more items once I release this, because I still have not made the thumbnail somehow of this project, and I haven't released this developer commentary up on YouTube, so those are the last things I need to do in order to completely like finish this project and like get a move on. After that, I don't know what the future really holds, but hopefully I'm not so much of a perfectionist. Anyway, thank you for listening to me ramble about this insane project, and if someone else makes a project that's like this big, I really hope they don't, especially because like this project is like, I don't know, you should not be making projects this big, especially not like on Scratch, but like if someone does, I really hope that they make it so that their workflow is like perfect, because like this is not sustainable. It is not sustainable to be making these huge hacking projects on Scratch, but like I do it anyways because I really love seeing like how far can you like push Scratch to the limits, how good can you make your products. But yeah, thank you for listening to me ramble. That is all from me, and thank you for playing my games and caring enough to watch these videos. Peace out.